Great way to start off your show, coughing. Normal America, host robnoerr. Another meta show here today. Wow. It's like mowing and stuff. Like when I mow, it's like for a day or two afterwards, I'm always coffee and is that a word, coffee? It's just an utterance that means, whatever. But I'm coughing a lot. It doesn't make for good streaming. I'm already a borderline unwatchable streamer. I got this high pitched voice. My mic's always screwing up. I have the worst takes that you'll find anywhere. Like just absolute pathetic. So the coughing really starts to put things to the totally unwatchable side of things. I don't know. I feel like I have an audience that just feels bad for me. That like there was a meeting that was like, look at this boomer fat old man that's trying to make a go of it streaming. Let's all pity him. I know, we'll make him play these stupid whip songs at the end of every show. Yeah. Works out for me. Anyways, what a great day. My new computer's supposed to come today. I do not imagine that I'll have that hooked up until tomorrow. My understanding is that I think it's the graphics card. They don't like to ship it with the graphics card in because if it jostles around, it could damage that. So Avarice is going to talk me through tomorrow, I think, how to install that. And then hopefully we'll get that set up. And then the new chair I'll get put together. Oh, man. Things really going up in the Noor household. Plus, my son's getting his playhouse built. That should be done by the end of the week. It's like a brand new house. It's basically like I've added another story to my attic to stream in. It's amazing. Now, what is this weird reflection coming from? You know what it is? Here, 1 second. You see that? Up on my... I bet it's this. I hope that fixed it. Yeah, it was... My door was open, so you're seeing my window out in the hall. That's how my attic is, We have a window up in the hall. I always, I of all the dumb shit that Brian Shaprio has said, I don't even get everything about that statement that I'm streaming from my second floor attic. Everything about it is laughable. It's to imply that I'm poor, but a second floor attic with a studio in it would probably be something that a wealthy person would do. But even if you take all of that and you unstrip all of that, so what? I never understood it. Yeah, you're right. I'm a poor nobody. And you're a massive syndicated radio host or whoever. Are you winning the argument? No? Well, that sounds more shameful. It's like this. My wife, sometimes me and my wife will be insulting each other. And she'll be like, what the hell is wrong with you? How do you, a grown-ass man with a massive pimple on your head? And my response will be like, yeah, but at least I'm not married to a grown-ass man with a pimple on his head. That would be embarrassing. I don't really give a shit how I look. I'd give a shit to be married to some guy that looks like me. That'd be terrible. Same with these people. They'll be like, you're so fucking stupid. Like Pisco the other night. You don't know the formal rules of logic. And yet you're getting your ass beat. That sounds bad for you. Yeah, okay, Brian Shapiro. I guess you're losing to a guy in his second floor attic over and over. Okay. Yeah, my attic, there is an attic, but it's sort of sealed off. I don't know. One time we had a hornet's nest that was I don't know what you call it, on the top crest of the house out here. And the buddy of mine checked in the attic to see if he could get out there and maybe poke at it. And he's like, it's not the worst attic in the world, but it's not great. So, I don't know. Anyways, today's show is going to be a nothing show. I just brought you all along for the ride. We're going to try round 2 of reviewing the Dave Smith Coleman Hughes debate. What a mess. If you missed this the other day, I don't know what to say. I'm just an idiot, a boomer. I blame StreamYard, to be quite honest. let me ask one of my audience members a question. Imaginarium, do you have a Rumble account? Oh, I don't think you do. Who can I trust that has a Rumble account? Ben Lonander, can you hear me over there on Rumble? If so, give me an affirmative or someone else that could go over to Rumble for me. What I'm going to need is, okay, old Joe, that's fine. Anyone who plans on sticking out, no, we're offended, you're offended, you're garbage. No, I'm just kidding. I need anyone, because I could pull that chat out separate and look at it and keep it in the corner of my eye in a way that I can't really do with StreamYard, I don't think. And so if someone, because as soon as I say this, some prick is going to screw it all up. So I'll tell you what I'm talking about. Last time I tried this, StreamYard crashed on me, and I didn't realize it because I'll fully admit one of my weak suits as a streamer is I get distracted by the audience. And the entire portion of this show, what I'm doing here, these debate reviews are going to go up as their own thing. And I would like it for my editor, Black Elk, to not have to edit out me being like, oh, by the way, legendary CEO, that's a great point. Like, that's not good because for what we're trying to do. We're trying to have this be for a different audience. Got you, old Joe. So an audience that doesn't really watch me live. So if you've never heard of me and you just type in like debate reviews, this could pop up and you watch, and it doesn't make sense if I'm interacting with the audience as much as just reviewing the debate. And so what happened last time was because I only had the video and I was just riffing, I ended up speaking for like an hour and a half to no one because the StreamYard collapsed and it didn't record. And so people were like, well, you should have had your chat up. And I was like, yeah, but if I have the chat up, I'll be reading the chat. So Ben and old Joe, I'll trust you two and only you two. If you guys are watching throughout, don't bullshit me, because if you bullshit me, it will ruin the video. And I know other people are going to bullshit me. So that's why I'm only trusting Ben and old Joe here. If, for whatever reason, it crashes, please type, hey, it crashed. Please don't bullshit me, because if you bullshit me, I'm going to say, what? Huh? And then it's going to ruin the video. So, but that's what happened last time. Now, that's never happened before. I never had StreamYard collapse on me like that. But look, all kinds of weird shit. Here's a $20 donation. Perry Incorporated. Thank you for the 20, man. Says, what up, Rob? Took today off, so I'll be around to listen. Really enjoy your debate analysis. Feel free to stretch 10 minutes into an hour. It will be. It'll be a long one. But see, the super chat goal thing's not working. So I have no idea what's going on. Like, there's just little problems with StreamYard. I don't know. Anyways, so I'm about to stop interacting with the audience, and we're going to do this debate review. But I promise I will interact with the audience afterwards, take your comments on what you thought of my debate review, read all of your super chats. So feel free to still that get in. What did I just say? Still free to that get in? What the fuck kind of dyslexic statement was that? Man, maybe this is not a good day for a debate review. Better get a drink here. What's going on? Thank you, old Joe. All right. English good speak me. Review of debate. Smith Dave, Coleman Hughes. What think Israel good policy America? This is going to be a good review. I feel it. I feel it in my bones. All right. I'm going to put this down. This debate is Coleman Hughes versus Dave Smith. We're starting 55 minutes in. I will put the link up. You guys could watch the whole video if you like. I might as well try the intro here. My editor tells me I'm supposed to do an intro, so let's try that real quick. Hey, I'm robnoerr, Debate Coach Rob. On this channel, we like to go through some of the biggest debates that are occurring on issues that matter today. As a former college debate champion and champion coach, Today we're going to be looking at Coleman Hughes versus Dave Smith from a few months ago before the Iran invasion and having a conversation about Israel and their influence on foreign policy. If you like this content, please consider liking and subscribing. We plan on putting these reviews up weekly. Enjoy the show. All right, we did that. And then let's do, no, that's wrong. All right, here we go. All right, I'm going to get started. Remember, I promise I will get all super chats read towards the end of this. So, let me get this up. Let me get ready. So this debate, we're going to be looking, you have Coleman Hughes on the left there. I don't know much about Coleman Hughes. I've seen just a couple little clips of him. He seems like a very reasonable guy. I would think he's conservative based on what I've seen, probably a Trump supporter. And on the right is Dave Smith. Dave Smith, more of a libertarian or libertarian adjacent person. I personally like Dave. I've moderated a debate for him once. He's someone that I really enjoy listening to his thoughts. Dave, what I find most impressive about him is he's willing to mix it up with all sorts of people. So I've seen Dave mix it up with professors, to other comedians, to commentators. And I always really appreciated that about him, that he's willing to exchange these ideas and have debates with just about anyone. In this particular section, they had a conversation. I'm not sure what the formal introduction to this was, if it was supposed to be a formalized debate. It seems more like it was a conversation with topics that then get brought up, that they end up getting into a debate. The section we're going to be talking to, I have seen parts of this before as I tried to review this debate before, but the section is going to be specifically on Israel and their sort of control or lack of control over U.S. foreign policy decisions, particularly how much Israel was responsible for forcing the United States' hand in the Iraq War. Now, Dave is going to be arguing that Israel did sort of force and control the United States to go into the Iraq War, and Coleman Hughes is going to be negating that position. So, first thing to remember is Dave's going to be the affirmative on this claim, so that means that sort of the burden of proof is more on him. So, my full bias is I am sort of libertarian adjacent, used to be. Now I'm more of a traditional or a populist conservative. I'm not a big fan of the Iraq War, not a big fan of Trump's current intervention into Iran. However, on the question of Israel, although I feel they have too much influence, I certainly don't go as far as many other people thinking that they're responsible for almost all U.S. foreign policy. So I'll try my best to operate outside the scope of that bias, but I just want to be honest with what my bias is as we get into this debate. So this is starting at 55 minutes, 29 seconds. The link to Coleman Hughes' video will be there so you can check out the entire thing if you want. And thank you to both Coleman and Dave Smith for this great opportunity to be able to review an important debate like this. So let's jump in.
Okay, let's move on because there are other topics I want to get to. One of your big arguments, and you've made this on Rogan and elsewhere, is that Israel got us into the Iraq War, or more specifically, pro-Israeli interests were a key factor, a key influence that pushed America into the war in Iraq. So I want to give you the floor to make your case here.
Now, for this conversation, granted, this is Coleman Hughes' show, and Dave is a guest on the show. One of the things perceptually Coleman's been doing very good the entire conversation is he sort of is gearing the conversation to the topics that he thinks are most important. Now, this doesn't mean that Dave doesn't think these conversations are important or these topics are important, but it's very good because perceptually it puts sort of an air of control over what Coleman's doing. Now, it makes sense. It's his show, so I'm not saying Dave should intervene and stop, but it definitely puts Coleman off as sort of this like analytic thinker that's thinking about the positions. And going from this, Coleman did something that's very amazing. The topic right previous to this, Dave Smith got the final word. And a lot of people have a tendency in debates to always have to have the final word on every point. And that's actually a mistake. if you have that mentality, what happens is oftentimes you get bogged down in one point and you don't make it to points that may be more important. Remember, your audience is sort of a general audience. They're not like keeping track with the scorecard, like, well, who had the last point? That's oftentimes irrelevant. So good on Coleman here for leaving Dave Smith have the last point in the previous topic and then moving on here.
Yeah, well, I mean, if for John Mearsheimer, as you were just mentioning him, so I just was at the top of my mind, but he wrote a book called The Israel Lobby, where he really details this pretty extensively with all the footnotes and citations that you need.
I've read it. I find it totally unconvincing, but
well, I mean, I don't even know how do you find it unconvincing? I mean, obviously,
I'll tell you.
This is actually a big mistake on Dave's part here, and in my opinion. When you're the affirmative, it's a huge advantage to get to speak first and to frame your argument. Most of the debate's going to stem usually from what you say in that initial framing. So in this case, okay, Dave, the topic is your belief that Israel was instrumental or key into forcing the United States into invading Iraq. Would you like to make your case? This is an opportunity for Dave to sort of give an outline for his beliefs and then delve into the specifics within that outline. So it's usually very important to take advantage of that framing mechanism. Oftentimes in debate, you might consider this an opening statement. Now, granted, this isn't a formal debate, but this is sort of an informal call to, okay, give your opening statement to frame this. And Dave starts to say, well, this Mearsheimer book, and Coleman's like, I've read it, I'm not impressed. And Dave says, why? Now, what this does already is it muddies the waters. Coleman did nothing wrong, really. In fact, he gave Dave the opportunity as the affirmative of this claim to sort of outline and give the opening statement on it. But Dave sort of opened the door to abdicate that by saying, well, this Mearsheimer book, and Coleman's like, I don't respect that book. And he says, tell me why. And already then it breaks the framing. Now, the framing comes less on the central claim of, did Israel have a key role in the United States invasion of Iraq? And more, well, what about this Mearsheimer guy? Is he trustworthy and his claims trustworthy? And it really switches that burden and switches the framing. So I think this is a mistake. If I'm Dave Smith, if Coleman says, I don't trust Mearsheimer, I'd say, well, nonetheless, here's the rest of my argument and get through it. And then at some point later say, well, tell me why you don't trust Mearsheimer. So good on Coleman for taking this opportunity because even though he did the right thing, giving Dave the chance to make his case, Dave's sort of abdicating that gives Coleman an in to, in an ethical way, be like, okay, I'll answer your question.
Well,
okay.
I wanted to give you, okay, so
sure.
I'll tell you
well,
why
I'll lay out the case if you want first, but sure.
No,
yeah.
okay, well, if we're talking about Mearsheimer, let's talk about that, and then you can lay out.
See, Dave should have been like, no, let me finish. Let me lay out the case. But, okay, fair enough. It's an informal debate, so not a big deal. But we'll see. I think what you're going to see, and as I've admitted, normally I do these reviews without looking at them ahead of time. This one, unfortunately, I had some technical issues, so I've seen these parts of it. And I think what you're going to see is Coleman really does a great job of controlling the direction and the tone of the debate. So he always seems like one step ahead, and he understands that he's able to control exactly the framing in each of the meta portions of this debate. And I think this is a good first example of that.
Whatever other
Sure.
elements of the case you think are compelling. So the idea that the domestic Israel lobby is big enough or powerful enough to get America to fight an entire war that we would not otherwise have fought is to me ridiculous. And now I'll give you a few touch points.
Notice how it's almost like Coleman is giving the framework that I was suggesting Dave did. So instead of just saying, I don't trust Mearsheimer, he's like, here's why I don't trust Mearsheimer. And then he outlines the case why it's absurd to think that Israel was instrumental in controlling the United States to go into Iraq. So as an audience viewer, right now, let's just say hypothetically that you had to, you can only watch 3 minutes of this and you're starting at the beginning. Coleman's the one who's the initial, hey, here's why I think your claim's wrong, before Dave even got a chance to really give any reasons as to why his affirmative was correct. The lesson to take from this is, when you are the affirmative, make sure those opening statements are very important. They set the outline for what your debate's going to be about, For me, I always work backwards. I go, what is the final points that I want to be making? And what must I talk about in the middle of the debate to get there? And therefore, what is my opening statement to outline sort of a roadmap for how I'm going to get there at the end of the day? It's important because it sets a framing mechanism for an audience to easily be able to understand what your argument is and where you're going. And because Dave hasn't had that opportunity, Coleman is actually doing that in the inverse. So he's outlining the initial framing. Speaking first and speaking last in a debate, both of those are hugely important. Normally, the affirmative gets that because it's an advantage, and we give the affirmative that advantage. The negative's advantage is they don't have to affirm anything. They don't have to prove anything or move any offense. Now, it's incumbent upon them that they should do that. But all they have to do is prove that the affirmative case is wrong. They don't have to prove a better case. So that's the negative's advantage. So it's sort of a mistake to allow the negative to speak first like this.
During the entire George W. Bush administration, the Israel lobby spent $17 million lobbying Congress. Now, that might sound like a lot to me or you. It is absolute chump change on the scale of domestic lobbying. To put it in perspective, the tobacco lobby spent $200 million, so more than 10 times that amount over the same time period. And they couldn't even stop Congress from passing a federal tax hike on cigarettes in 2009. Now, during the Obama era, the Israel lobby spent $30 million. And they were outspent by the dentists. The dentist lobby spent $32 million. This is all according to opensecrets.org, which is usually the standard source people go to for such figures.
Now, it's a very good strategy. Coleman is first making an argument that speaks to the ability of Israel to do this. And he is implicitly saying that money is indicative of the ability to do that. And he says, okay, implicitly we all understand that there's this problem with lobbying and people paying money, big money in government to get positions that they want. Okay, fine. But Israel's actually spent less money during the George W. Bush years than the tobacco lobby or than the dental lobby. And the tobacco lobby spent way more money and was unable to get the signature issues that they wanted. The dental lobby, we don't say that they're responsible for huge foreign policy decisions. So it's a good initial framing of, we just don't think Israel would have that ability. And then he further, after citing the figures, which is nice, he says the source is something that we should both agree on, Open Secrets, which is sort of a universally accepted source when it comes to these questions of how much money is being sent. It's a very effective strategy, and so it'll be upon Dave to argue, okay, but there are other reasons that speak to Israel's power and to being able to influence. Because ultimately what this is going to come down to is Coleman's going to have to concede at some point that some of the actions that U.S. foreign policy has taken, in this case the overthrowing of Saddam, were in agreement with actions that Israel wanted. But does that mean that Israel was key in controlling those decisions? Or is it just correlation? In other words, it's not causation, it's correlation. For example, China could hypothetically want Saddam to be overthrown, but will we say if the United States invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam that it was China that controlled them? Probably not. So Coleman's starting the initial groundwork of saying Israel wouldn't even have the ability to influence based on how much money they gave. So it'll be interesting to see how Dave responds to this.
This is, again, not to repeat my favorite phrase, but like a firefly to the sun when compared to the $2 billion, for instance, that Wall Street spent lobbying Congress, and they couldn't even prevent Dodd-Frank from being passed. So the idea that the domestic Israel lobby could get us to fight an entire war that we wouldn't otherwise have fought at the same price as the dentists are paying Congress is too much for me.
Right. Oh, this is a topic for another show, but the bankers love Dodd-Frank, and I think they were quite happy with that bill being. But that's a topic for another show.
They tried to prevent it from being passed, and only once they failed did they try to mold it as a plan B to their own image. So
yeah, I mean, look,
you can't start don't start the movie in the middle. They failed with $2 billion to prevent it being passed.
I think you're the one who's missing the firefly for the sun, or whatever your analogy was in that case with the big banks. It's like, look, man, you could talk about these people who like get contribute tons of money to candidates in Washington, D.C., and then point out the one area where they didn't get the policy that they wanted, or they didn't get their A plan and only got their B plan. Okay, but then if you zoom out, you can look at how the whole system is rigged in their favor. They get free money and then lend it out to the American people. I think it seems to be working out pretty good for them rigging this system. But onto the Israel.
You know, a sort of an aside, but if I had to tie it to the central topic of this conversation, Coleman's basically making the argument: just because people are spending money doesn't mean they get what they want. And they spend, sometimes they get money, or they get what they want, sometimes they don't, and then they have to readjust. And Dave's like, yeah, but more often than not, they are getting what they want, which is probably true. I guess a way to make Dave's argument maybe a little cleaner would just be, well, why are these people giving money if it's never effective? Of course, like, it has to be effective at times, and we know that it is. We know that a lot of times the groups that are giving the big money are, you know, on average, getting things that they want. Of course, the counter to this, Sir Coleman would be like, yeah, but it doesn't prove that it's the reason that something occurred. Like, if I send $1,000, you know, and I like to mix Kool-Aid with pineapple slices or something, I don't think the pineapple slice Kool-Aid lobby is responsible then because a bill gets passed that we like or something to that effect. So it's not really germane as a major point to the debate here. And again, no problem, because this is more of a conversation than a debate. But when you take a look at the grand scheme of things, we're probably about 5 minutes into this topic of conversation, and it's Dave's affirmative claim. And so far, he spent more time talking about Dodd-Frank than the actual Israel controlling. So now he's going to get into it.
Israel lobby thing. I mean, look, again, this isn't refuting any of what Mearsheimer said. Mearsheimer simply claimed that because you're talking about AIPAC, and he's talking about the entire lobby.
No. Those numbers I gave were the entire pro-Israel lobby, of which AIPAC is something like half.
Okay, fine. But But you're talking AIPAC and the American Enterprise Institute and the Washington.
I'm talking
Institute
about
for
every organization that's listed under the pro-Israel lobby on Open
But
Secrets.
what he's talking about for most of the book, which is really what I'm always hammering down. I mean, look, there's no question, like, AIPAC supported the war, and some of these other, or the American Enterprise Institute, they all supported the war, and they threw money toward that, and they lobbied for it. But this was a neoconservative war. I mean, the neoconservative, like, I don't think there's any chance. Look, the Iraq War was highly debated. It was
Now, again, I could try to think where Dave's going with this, but he doesn't make the point that cleanly. So he starts off saying, no, that's just AIPAC money. And Coleman responds, no, it's basically all of the lobby. Now, that may or may not be true, but for the context of this debate, Dave doesn't push back that efficiently on this. He's like, well, that's just one thing. There were all these other things. And now he starts going into neocons. So he needs to draw the line out with what he's suggesting, because him being like, well, the neocons are responsible. Right. But where does that prove that Israel forced the neocons' hands? That's sort of where we're at.
Contested. It was contested in Congress. There were people who were against it. There were uniformed military people who were against it. There were people at the State Department who were for it. And the neocons were the ones who really pushed it through. And look, I mean, Coleman, you look at who the neocons were, okay? In their own words, they have deep loyalty to Israel. Every last one of them has said in their own words that they have a deep commitment toward Israel. They're writing all of their policy papers through the 1990s on how we have to overthrow the government in Iraq as part of this clean break strategy on behalf of Israel. And then they are all of George W. Bush's men. Literally, once the towers come down, George W. Bush is in the White House. It's a project for a new American century, all down his staff, down from his defense secretary, his vice president, and all of their men. They're at the State Department, the Defense Department. And so it is not going out on a limb to say, yeah, this war doesn't happen without the neoconservatives. And I think John Mearsheimer very reasonably puts them as part of the Israel lobby. All you have to do is read their own words. It's not like I'm putting together some conspiracy. By the way, I love that Mearsheimer points out in that book, because I do think there's a real interesting point to make, that he's not saying it was a Jewish war. Like, the Jewish people in America actually opposed the war in Iraq much more so than just about any other group. I think the polling data was they were way out ahead against the war in Iraq. I forget the exact numbers.
Yes, that's
but yeah, there's no question that, call it whatever you want to. I mean, like, they would basically through the 90s self-identify as the American version of the Likudnik party, but whatever you want to call it, these group of people who have in their own words admitted they have like profound loyalty and connection to Israel, pushed for this war, and they had written in their own words that a huge part of it was because this was the strategy for
Okay. So a little bit of hyperbole, which I don't mind. Anytime you're saying every one of them, all of their writings, a bit much. Now, it doesn't matter. I know what he means. You know what he means. No big deal. But it's going to fall into Coleman's strategy here in a minute, as we'll see. So the argument interesting here is what's not about direct monies given. That's the direction that Dave's taking it. It's more that these politicians, regardless of how much money is sent to them by Israel, just have a deep love for Israel and think that we should protect them, and their writings prove that. And he signposted a couple things here that I know Coleman picked up as well of what those writings would be. The first is clean break, part of the clean break memo strategy. Now, this is a specific memo that will be referenced to become key later in the debate, but there's your impression as an audience, like, okay, that's the sort of stuff he's talking about. Then he talks about all of George Bush's men were a project for a new American century. This is a specific group of neocons that would have sort of policy ideas, etc. And he's saying all of them, the project for a new American century, all of Bush's people were from this group. And this is what they were writing about the importance of going into Iraq largely or in a key way because of Israel. Now, this isn't a bad argument. It's not necessarily just the amount of money that's being sent. Certainly could be that, like, let's say that, make the argument simpler, that Bush is friends with Netanyahu. And Netanyahu calls and says, my friend, will you overpose Saddam? And he says, sure. That wasn't even on our radar, but yeah, we'll do it. It wouldn't matter how much money, Israel sent George Bush. It would still be a fair statement to say Israel was largely responsible for convincing the United States to go into Iraq and for that decision. We'd all agree with that. So that's sort of the argument at this point that Dave's making. It's not about money from AIPAC. It's about the neocons that were responsible basically being the U.S. version of the Likud party that's more interested in sort of Israel and their situation than other issues. So Coleman's going to respond here. Let's see how he responds.
Help Israel.
None of this is true, Dave. Okay, so let's look
yes,
at
it is. It's all true.
Let's look at their own words. Project for a New American Century is founded in 1998. If you go to their archive online, you can find the earliest thing written about Iraq by a member. The earliest thing is written by John Bolton, 1997. Here's the...
Now, this is actually very brilliant. And for me, watching this debate, what comes across most is just how prepared Coleman is. It's very much like the old cliche when it comes to lawyers. You don't ask a witness a question that you don't already know the answer to. Remember when I said Coleman did a good job of sort of steering to the topics that he wanted to talk about? I feel like Coleman has probably heard Dave make these claims before, and so he has looked into the documents that Dave's talking about. So Dave could say, all of the writings said this, and Coleman's going to say, okay, all the writings, Project for a New American Century, here's their first writing, and here's what it said. Did it say what you're suggesting? Okay, how about their next writing? Did it say what you're suggesting? No. And it really, in this case, normally the hyperbole is not a big deal, but it sort of pushes back to the thrust of what Dave's saying, which is, that everything they were writing was about this. In other words, the vast majority of it. Well, if the exact group that you're talking about being responsible, neocons and Project for a New American Century, which you said was basically all of them, had been writing for years, and Coleman's able to frame it as, no, here was their first writings on the issue, and they're talking about WMDs, not Israel, that really, really is an argument in favor of Coleman's side. And remember, as the affirmative, Dave has to advance the position and win. Coleman just has to prove that that doesn't seem to be the case.
First sentence of the earliest thing written on the PNAC archive. You might think the United Nations would want to punish Saddam Hussein for disrupting and nearly killing the UN's own efforts to eliminate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Instead, the UN Security Council effectively rewarded him. The next year, when the PNAC is actually founded, as you know, they write a letter to Bill Clinton. Now, this is the first time that PNAC, the neocons, call for the ouster of Saddam Hussein, right, publicly.
No, this is the first time the Project for a New American Century called for him. It's not the first time the
That's what I
neocons
said.
have publicly
Sorry.
called for him. Right. But it's not. No, you said the neocons. It's not the first time the neocons had called for it publicly.
Correct. We'll get to that. Apologies. So the first time Panak calls for the ouster of Saddam Hussein in 98, they write a letter to Bill Clinton. The entire letter is about the fact that Saddam has WMDs or is pursuing WMD, and we can't let it happen. And this is how the letter ends. We urge you to act decisively. If you act now to end the threat of weapons of mass destruction against the U.S. or its allies, you will be acting in the most fundamental national security interests of the country. If we accept a blah, 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 blah. Okay. So Israel is mentioned once in that letter, and it's grouped in with all of our other allies in the region. It's like they say, also, this will be good for Israel and Jordan and our other allies in the region. So Panak, this idea that the Project for a New American Century, that you and I both agree is a good bellwether for the neocons, was not using the WMD argument. It was their main argument. It was almost their only argument long before Iraq. Now let's get to this clean break.
Now, it's a good framing. Coleman's always doing a good job of framing as he gives so he's talking about something specific. He's going to a specific piece of evidence, and then he's explaining to his opponent and to the audience what that means in the framing of the overarching. So here he says, look, the original writings for Project for a New American Century, it is quite clear that they are heavily focused. Basically, their only argument is WMDs, not that we have to do this for Israel. And by the way, Dave, we both agree PNAC is the organization we should be looking to for a bellwether for neocons. That's very effective, right? Because one of the arguments he's anticipating is Dave saying, well, that's just one aspect, Project for a New American Century. There's all this other stuff. But Coleman could say, but we already both mutually agreed that this was in fact, you brought it up, Dave. You brought up PNAC first. So again, it's very subtle, but it's good. It's influential to an audience because oftentimes what happens, you have to remember this, it's difficult yourself in a debate to keep track of all of the information at times, particularly if you have a broad discussion. And this debate, I have to credit both participants, has been very good thus far of being polite and letting the other side get their thoughts out. If you've watched any of these internet debates, you know that sometimes it's not that simple. Sometimes people are interrupting the whole time, and it makes it difficult to keep your train of thought and say, well, what exactly did this specific meta argument mean to the grander scheme of things? So it's always good to be able to continue to maintain letting yourself, your opponent, and the audience know real briefly the framing of, and by the way, this is why this is important. So kudos to Coleman for that. Let's hear Dave's response.
But this is just, wait, hold on. But Coleman, this is just not right. I mean, you've read A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm and coping with crumbling states. I assume
That wasn't about U.S. foreign policy.
Now, again, props to Coleman's preparation. And Dave, it seems like he's got these documents and these organizations that he's talked about a lot. I sympathize with this. I'm in the same boat. Oftentimes when you have a topic that very much interests you, you'll find the key sort of things within that that help make that argument. And so it's clear that Coleman's heard Dave say this before. So first it's the neocons, a Project for a New American Century. Okay. Well, first it's the idea of Israel lobbying. And Coleman's like, well, here's what Open Secret says. It wasn't that bad. Okay, but it's neocons, a Project for a New American Century. Okay, let's see what they were writing. And then Dave immediately goes, yeah, but it's the Clean Break memo. Now, as you can see, Coleman's going to be prepared to argue against the Clean Break memo as well. Now, remember, Dave's the affirmative. He has to prove his case. Coleman doesn't have to prove anything. He just has to show that Dave hasn't proven his case. And thus far, it appears as if Coleman's making significant inroads into the specific claims that Dave's making. The funding of Israel, didn't seem to be that bad the way we ended up leaving that conversation. The Project for a New American Century seemed that they were heavily focused on WMD and barely any on Israel. Now we're moving on to the Clean Break memo. What's important to remember is if you're evaluating the performances in the debate, you might say, but I know that to not be the case. I know Israel, for example, sent more money. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But keep in mind, the majority of an audience aren't going to have access to these specific facts. And so ask yourself, if you're walking into this conversation and you don't know much about the topic, who's winning the debate? And right now it seems quite clearly that's Coleman. He's able to take these specific claims that Dave's making, and he's able to say, wait a minute, let's delve into the specifics. And then instead of Dave really pushing back, he's like, yeah, but there's this other thing, which gives Coleman a chance to go, okay, let's talk about that other thing.
Was a recommendation for Israeli foreign policy.
Yes, okay, but you're saying they talk openly about wanting to overthrow Saddam Hussein for the clean break strategy. Like, so, okay, like, yes, in the letter to Bill Clinton, they didn't say that, but they had written openly about this.
No,
it's the entire strategy that they laid out. And we also have a 4-star general who's on record saying that he saw these plans, that they were going to go overthrow all of these governments.
So what Dave's doing is he's outlining a bunch of specific things. There's the funding from Israel. There is the Project for a New American Century and neocons that wrote about Israel. There is the Clean Break memo. There is the Wesley Clark. And Coleman's doing a very good job of going step by step through them. One thing that could happen is you could get lost in a debate if people list 5, 6, 7 reasons for something to be the case. And it just seems overwhelming. Well, if those 4 things are true, then we have to accept this conclusion. And Coleman is calmly like, let's go through them one by one. Let's talk about the funding. Let's talk about Project for a New American Century. Let's talk about the Clean Break memo. Let's talk about Wesley Clark. So he's going to go through those one by one. And that's how you deal with something like that. It's not to say that it's not an effective strategy for Dave to say, look, there's a lot of things that point to this conclusion. It's just, you have to be willing to go deep and dive into each one of those claims to see if that's the case.
Let's deal with one at a time. The Clean Break memo. The Clean Break memo, written by Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, all these neocons.
David Wormser.
In 1996. It is a recommendation to Israel, to the Likud, to Benjamin Netanyahu, to say, here are some things we think that Israel should prioritize. It is not a recommendation about what American foreign policy should prioritize. That's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is that...
Okay, so he's going to give multiple reasons. Again, remember, Coleman doing a better job of framing the arguments. Ask yourself right now, why did Dave bring up the Clean Break memo? And again, that could help intuit the effectiveness of Dave's strategy. Now, let me be clear, I like Dave Smith. And it is easy to Monday morning quarterback like I'm doing right now and say, here would have been a better way to phrase this. So I'm not saying that it's egregious or anything on Dave's behavior or on his situation that he has going on here. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm just saying you may forget, wait a minute, why did he bring this up based on the performance thus far? And that's not good when you're the affirmative. That's not good if you're making arguments and the audience is struggling to find, well, what exactly is the relevance? So the Clean Break memo, remember, is him saying, here was this memo that sort of orchestrated what Israel wanted and how the United States was going to follow that at the behest of Israel, or largely because of Israel. So Coleman's first argument is, this had nothing to do with the United States. It was a memo written by some dudes saying what Israel should do. That's completely different than the United States is taking some action because Israel wants them to. That's a completely different thing. So that's his first point. This wasn't a memo written to the United States that said, you should do these pro-Israel things. This is a memo written to Israel saying these are things that would be good for you.
When that paper advocates overthrowing Saddam, the point of overthrowing Saddam was to replace him with a Hashemite monarch that would be friendly to Israel, like Jordan is friendly to Israel. That's the whole point. The point of deposing Saddam was not to replace it with a democracy. That is nowhere in the Clean Break memo. So question for you, if the Clean Break memo was some kind of blueprint, why didn't we even make an attempt to replace Saddam with a Hashemite monarchy?
It's an excellent point. Dave's theory is this memo was the blueprint for what the United States is going to do to help Israel. And Coleman's like, okay, it says overthrow Saddam, but the reason is to install this monarchy that would be pro-Israel. But we never even attempted that. There wasn't any attempt at installing any monarchy. Instead, it was immediately to democracy. So could it be that just this memo had one goal that was shared with the United States, but that this wasn't the blueprint? If it was the blueprint, wouldn't intuit that we would have tried all the things there in it. Let's see Dave's response.
Oh yeah, I mean that's a good point. I think the whole thing fell apart, right? I mean, like
but we never even contemplated it. We never even floated the idea. So how could it be therefore true that the clean break memo is some kind of blueprint?
Well, Chalabi was like Judith Miller's big source on the whole thing, right? I think that a lot of the neocons seem to really believe that that was going to be what happened, and that's not what happened after they invaded the country. But Coleman, I mean, like you're sitting here saying like, okay, so these people are like, they're writing to Benjamin Netanyahu saying, here's the strategy for a clean break to get away from the peace process so you don't have to give up a Palestinian state and you can keep the status quo going. And so what we think you ought to do for that is overthrow this guy Saddam Hussein. And then you have them advocating for overthrowing Saddam Hussein for years more after that. Then they actually get into power and they do the thing. And we're supposed to pretend like that there's no connection there. I'm not like connecting wild dots. I'm saying like they said this is what their interest was. This is why they wanted it done, and then they did the thing.
Okay, so Dave makes the claim. Again, he could have done a better job here, but he does make the claim that this is how I would have phrased it. I think this is what Dave's saying. But Coleman, the very people that wrote that memo would end up running the George Bush administration. And so if they're saying to Israel, here's what you should do that would be good for you, and then when they're running the Bush administration, they do exactly that, wouldn't that suggest that their motivations had something to do with Israel? Now, Coleman's probably going to respond, but if that was the case, why didn't they follow everything within the clean break memo? And Dave sort of gave his answer, which was, well, things fell apart. To which Coleman's response is, but we didn't even attempt. And I don't know, Dave hasn't given a sufficient answer to that point yet. But let's listen.
No, that's not true. I mean, it's not true because Richard Pearl was not saying what America should do. He was saying what he thought Israel should do. What we ended up doing was not what was in the clean break memo. Your whole argument is that what we ended up doing was what was in this memo. It's not true. We deposed Saddam, and nowhere in the clean break memo does it say make Iraq a democracy. No Israeli Likud member would think you can make Iraq a democracy. They thought that notion was ridiculous. So what we ended up doing had nothing to do with what Richard Pearl recommended and everything to do with what George Bush thought would make sense. And you could be totally critical of that idea,
of all of
but
that.
You cannot argue that what we did the clean break memo. That's just factually incorrect.
No,
and then everything else Panak is saying, their entire argument is WMD,
Coleman,
WMD. You don't find Israel there.
Coleman.
Again, Coleman does a great job of framing. Again, it's an impressive, like he's doing an impressive job of letting the audience know. Look, like we go back to the Project New American Freedom. It's WMD, WMD, WMD. We go to the clean break memo. We did not do the things within the clean break memo. It doesn't matter what Richard Pearl wanted. It matters what George W. Bush wanted. And you may be against George W. Bush, but it's clear his focus was WMDs, not Israel. Remember, the burden is on Dave as the affirmative to prove his case that it was largely because of Israel that we invaded Iraq. Now, why is that going to matter to today? Because that's an area where people really focus on that sort of helps justify the argument today that our foreign policy is controlled by Israel. So if they say it about Iraq and you could say, look, that's not the case with Iraq, then it breaks significant inroads to say that's the way it's always been and that's the way it continues to be. So, again, we'll see if Dave can respond to this point.
This is like if I point to General Wesley Clark saying we're going to overthrow 7 governments in the next 5 years and that decision's being made. And then you say, yeah, dude, but we didn't overthrow. It took us like 15, 20 years to do that. Like, yes, of course. Obviously, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and, Condoleezza Rice or Colin Powell at the time. Obviously, all these guys had influence on this too. And so I'm not claiming that the piece of paper came to life and everything that was on it magically happened after that. It's still a pretty important paper to look at. And this was written by people who were in positions of substantial power when the time came due. And so, yes, you're right. The spreading democracy to Iraq, which seemed to, at least in George W. Bush's estimation, be an essential selling point to the war. You're right. That wasn't in the paper, and that got added later. But I think it's still pretty relevant.
That's kind
Now, again, already sort of forget about the exact like debate format and stuff. Already a lot of the impression that Dave gave through his argument that Israel was like the key factor. Already it seems that there's some walking back because now it's like, sure. There was a bunch of things. And this clean break memo is one of a bunch. But that doesn't mean the clean break memo didn't have any impact. Yeah, but that's different than it was the key impact. So already I think perceptually you see a bit of walking back by Dave here, and the idea that, well, okay, they didn't do what was really in, he immediately moves on to the next, well, the Wesley Clark thing. And so I just have to say that although there is nothing wrong with the strategy of saying, the reason I've came to my position is the following 5 pieces of evidence, Israel's money that they've given out and the Project for a New American Century writings and the Clean Break memo and the Wesley Clark comments. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But as you're discussing each one of them, it seems like Dave, well, okay, let's talk about AIPAC lobbying. And his response is like, maybe that's not all of it. And anyways, the Clean Break memo or the Project for a New American Century writings. And Coleman's like, well, let's talk about those. And Dave's like, well, yeah, but the Clean Break memo. Okay, let's talk about that. Well, my answer to that is, what about Wesley Clark? And so it's fine to have a bunch of examples, but you shouldn't point to another one of your examples as proving the example you're on. It's not the best way to go about that, because the impression comes, it's like, it's circular. Well, A must be true because B, and B must be true because C, and C must be true because of A. And it's like, yeah, but if I'm saying A's not true, you can't be like, but it must be because of B, which is true because of C, which is true because of A, because I'm saying A's not true. So it's, again, I think Coleman's doing a very good job here.
of half the enchilada. Let's talk about this.
No, it's I don't see. Okay.
Let's talk about this Wesley Clark memo that he never saw. Okay. So 4-star General Wesley Clark.
He never saw it?
Yeah, he says so in the season.
Now, again, right here, I think that, again, you have to really chalk this up to Coleman's preparation for this debate. Now, again, kudos to Dave Smith, because the reason that Coleman would be able to prep so thoroughly is because Dave has been quite open with his commentary. And so, it's not like Dave's someone who's hiding. He says exactly what he thinks, which I find to be very respectable. I know that's a low bar to clear, but so many times in a lot of these discussions you see in these debates, it's people not telling you what they honestly think, instead of trying to win an argument in the here and now, as opposed to just, this is what I believe. But Coleman's done an excellent job, and so now he's prepared to be like, okay, now let's go this memo, Wesley Clark, which he never saw. And Dave gives the impression that, he never saw it, sort of without saying it. What Dave was really implying there was, what are you talking about? Of course he saw it. And Coleman's going to explain here and get a quick concession from Dave, which again, perceptually hurts Dave's case and helps make Coleman's case. If you're looking at it through a just pure logic driven, well, wait a minute, it doesn't really matter if Dave implied Wesley Clark had seen the memo, but he hadn't. That's really small potatoes in the grand scheme of things as far as the logic of it goes. But remember, debate's not just about, X's and O's and who wins that sort of equation. It's also about how you present yourself and the perceptions that people are getting. And if you say something and then it has to be backtracked over enough times, that might add up to people being like, perceptually, I think I trust the other guy more.
Spent interview. You don't remember this? He's talking about it. He says
that
this guy. He says I'm talking to the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yeah. He says he handed him the paper and he was like, all right. Don't look at that.
He says, do not show this to me. I don't want to be on the hook for seeing classified info.
Yeah, I think it was. You're talking about the interview with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now, right?
Yes. So,
and I do think that both Coleman and Dave, I have to tip my cap to both of them. They clearly have a knowledge far more than me on specific things, the exact names of authors that wrote the Clean Break memo, the exact interviews where some of these things were being talked about, and who the interviewer was. So kudos to them both for having that knowledge.
The memo that Wesley Clark never saw. Okay, it said, according to his hearsay, and it would be dismissed in a court as hearsay, that we're going to overthrow 7 countries in 5 years: is Iraq, then Syria, then Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Iran. So the first thing I want to say about this is that Pentagon memos in the Bush White House were called snowflakes because they came so often and they piled up on your desk. And let me read to you from the Washington Post at the time. Rumsfeld, whose sometimes abrasive approach often alienated other cabinet members, produced 20 to 60 snowflakes, these memos, snowflakes a day, 20 to 60 a day. Regularly poured out his thoughts in writing as the basis for developing policy. And Rumsfeld's aide, Keith Urban, which is a funny name, estimated that he wrote 20,000 memos during his time in the George W. Bush White House. And then we have from National Security Counterterrorism Advisor Richard Clarke, who was in the room. He was close with Condoleezza Rice, National Security. He says, from time to time, Condoleezza Rice would show Clarke notes sent by the defense secretary, these snowflake memos, all telling her to stay off his turf. The first time she got one of them, she thought, what do I do with this? Says Clarke, who adds she was advised to ignore them. Every once in a while, one of these ranting Rumsfeld notes to Condi would come. You can almost hear the eye roll. Like, this dude Rumsfeld is drowning us in his little thoughts and his stupid memos. He sent 20 yesterday. I get 20 emails from someone. I'm like, dude, what the fuck? Send me one important one. So then this guy, 4-star General Wesley Clark, comes along, doesn't see the memo, hears about one memo, isn't privy to it because he's not allowed to see it, also isn't privy to the other 20 memos that day, isn't privy to the memos next week that might cancel out the strategy that was laid out. Do you have any evidence that this memo was actually important as opposed to one snowflake in a shifting strategy of 60,000?
Again, this is very good defensive evidence that's being brought forth by Coleman here, which is you're saying this memo is key, just like the clean break memo is key. But all right, if this was 1 in 20,000 memos that was written by Donald Rumsfeld, that everybody just rolled their eyes constantly. Here we go, another memo. And Dave Clark didn't even see the memo. He just heard from someone, hey, I heard Rumsfeld had this one memo that said X today. Where's your proof that this memo was key in whatever decisions would be made in the future? Could it be that some of the decisions were made in the future and no one even remembered this memo and no one took it seriously? And there's just certain things. If I write 20,000 memos with 20,000 different political or foreign policy strategies, there's probably a good chance at some point some of what I said in one of those memos would come true. Does that mean that that memo was key? No, it doesn't, especially seeing as how there were so many of them. Condoleezza Rice and company were like, we never even paid attention because there were so many. And Wesley Clark never even saw the memo. He just hears a guy talking about it. So let's see how Dave responds.
Well, I think, okay, so first of all, Wesley Clark has actually clarified a bunch of this more recently, but he did talk about how he had actually seen the plans originally a decade earlier in 1991.
That was some separate Israeli study, he said, right?
Yeah, well, it was a little bit clunky the way he said it. He said it came from Paul Wolfowitz's desk, and that he had brought it to Brent Scowcroft, I think, who had said, "Let's look at that after." He said it was resurrected in an Israeli study later, and it wasn't exactly clear what he was referring to there. But again, we got a 4-star general, right? And he was not saying. Because this was kind of weird when I remember Douglas Murray kind of taking a similar line with this when I had my conversation with him. But he wasn't saying like, oh, there's a memo or there's just like something like what Wesley Clark is saying. And you're right, it is him saying what he heard from someone else. But he was saying, and a 4-star general felt comfortable enough to like say this on national television, that he went to the Defense Department and was told that the decision had been made that we were not only going to Iraq. The way he tells the story is he came in and he found out they had decided they were going to invade Iraq. Then he comes back a couple months later, this is late 2001, and the guy goes, dude, it's so much worse than just Iraq. we're going to topple 7 countries in the next 5 years. Now, he said he goes to show him this, and Wesley Clark's like, I shouldn't really be looking at that document there, and this might be a crime for you to be showing this. But, okay, so what we have is a 4-star general saying he knew of these plans a decade later. The same group of people is now back in power after being kicked out, for the Clinton years. They're now back in power. He's saying the decision's been made that we're going to war with.
So Dave's saying, if I could steal man Dave's argument here, is Wesley Clark was a general and he put so much stock in this that he's openly talking about it. And that he's being told, look, the decision has been made by this guy at DOD. Now, we don't know who that guy is. So let's say that Coleman's correct, that all of these memos come and people in Condoleezza Rice's office are like, rolling their eyes like none of this matters, right? Dave supersedes that and says that could be true. He's not arguing that. And this is something that I think you can see throughout this entire debate. The importance of generalities versus specificity. An argument could be true in the general, but not true in the specific. I'll give you an example. I remember working with this car dealership one time. I think they were Chevy. It's been many years, but this was during or around the times of the 2008 financial crisis. And if it was Chevy, again, forgive me if I'm wrong about the specific manufacturer, but they were closing a bunch of dealerships. And so the dealership in my local town was getting closed down. They were no longer going to be able to sell Chevys. And they were pushing back. There was an appeals process. Now, the manufacturer had a lot of evidence about the decline in purchasing of Chevys, and it seemed to be true. The problem was, in the specific of this specific dealership, they were doing phenomenally. So two things could be true simultaneously. In general, around the country, Chevys were selling less. But in this specific dealership, they're doing tremendous. So why would you close this specific dealership? In other words, the more specific evidence overrides the more general evidence. So in this meta conversation right here, Dave Smith's making the argument, well, it may be true that there were all these memos and that Wesley Clark didn't get to read the memo and people in Condoleezza Rice would just roll their eyes. The fact that the person that Wesley Clark trusted in the DOD was putting so much significance on this memo that he was willing to risk possibly breaking the law by showing it and saying, trust me, dude, this is it. That would override the general sort of concern that you have. And it's a fair argument. It really is. Now, how would we resolve this? As an observer of this discussion, what are the types of things we would look to see whether or not this memo then, because we're basically at a standstill here. We see that this was one of many memos and almost no one took them serious, but this specific guy, nameless guy, took it serious in telling Wesley Clark. So how do we determine which side's more likely correct? Well, one of the things that you would probably do is say, did the outcomes in the memo come true? Was the plan outlined? Is it something that happened? So that's going to be the next area that we take the debate.
Hold on one second.
How would he know?
Hold on one second.
He wasn't even allowed to see the memo.
Let me just finish the point, okay? And then you can respond to this. He's saying, you're right, he didn't see the memo. It's just a 4-star general saying that somebody at the Defense Department told him the decision's to be made. And then in the following years, we didn't overthrow 7 countries in 5 years, but we did overthrow a bunch of the ones on the list or target a bunch of the ones on the list. And so, Coleman, my argument here isn't that, again, I'm not saying that memo came to life and exactly what was written down on that has happened. Of course, there were more memos. Of course, there were more decisions that were added in afterward. But isn't it kind of hard to, don't you find it to be a little bit of a coincidence that General Clark tells you the decision was made in 2001 that we were going to overthrow Gaddafi and Assad? Like just think about that. That was a wild claim in 2001 to be made. And then we did just that. You don't find that? That doesn't make your eyebrows poke up a little bit? Like that doesn't make you go like, oh,
I'll tell you why.
So he's claiming, look, a lot of the stuff in the memo actually came to fruition. Doesn't that make you skeptical? And now Coleman's going to respond. Again, that's exactly where I said the next step of the argument be. So let's see the response.
So it doesn't make my eyebrows raise for the following reasons. First of all, the people that actually saw the memo, like Condoleezza Rice, would say, oh, okay, another fucking 20 memos from Dawn. Put that in the special filing cabinet for my memos from Dawn, which is the trash bin. There's no evidence that this was some grand strategy, right? And the only evidence you have is the general who never saw the memo. So then you actually look at, is there any set of facts that would persuade you that this wasn't a plan? Because we didn't, 3 of the countries out of 7, almost half the countries have not done regime change, let alone within 5 years, let alone in the specific order prescribed by the memo. And so, and not to mention, we did do regime change in countries not on the memo at all, like Liberia. So there's actually no variable from the memo that actually matches our foreign policy. And so my question to you is like, is there any possible set of facts of U.S. foreign policy from the last 4 years that would persuade you that this memo was not important?
Again, it's
Now, again, another impressive framing job here. So the argument he makes is, yeah, there's been some of the things that memo outlined that occurred, but then there's been other things that were never even attempted. And also, there were things not mentioned in the memo that did occur revolving regime change. And so the point that he's trying to make, and maybe if there's one bit of, clearing it up a little that he could do, is just be like, listen, how do we know that this isn't correlation and not causation? If I wrote 20,000 memos and said, plan 1, overthrow these countries in this order. Plan 2, overthrow these countries. Plan 3, overthrow these. Plan 4, create trade deals with these. Inevitably, some of that stuff's going to come true. Even if it would turn out later that it's like, oh, that memo was never actually seen. You can still point to be like, oh, Rumsfeld could come out tomorrow and go, you know what? The exact situation that occurred, I actually wrote about that in memo 1723. The exact situation. Look at that. There it is. Wow. So that memo was responsible? Nah, I forgot to send that one to anyone. And yet if you just saw that memo, you'd go, oh my gosh. So that's the point he's trying to make. It's like, well, wait a minute. How do we know these things just didn't happen to occur and this memo wasn't the planning for or the reason for those things occurring? And then he further goes on with the framing and says, given that, what could we possibly provide you as evidence to show that this wasn't the case? And let's hear Dave's response. Again, another good framing tool.
It's not the memo that you keep saying. It's that Wesley Clark says the decision's been made that we're going to topple.
How would he know? He didn't even read the memo.
He's saying that his source at the Defense Department, and again,
so
keep in
is
mind,
it your argument that no one at the DOD would ever exaggerate or lie? Because
no,
if that's what you're saying, then who are you and what have you done with Dave Smith?
Okay, well, certainly, Coleman, that's a blatant straw man and not at all what I'm saying. So no, I'm not saying nobody would ever exaggerate. Sure.
But I mean, that's the weakness of Dave's argument that Coleman gets you here is, if you listen to this, it sounds like what Dave's suggesting is all of this hinges on the claims of one anonymous man. Granted, it's an anonymous man that Wesley Clark, took serious. But that's it at the end of the day. If that guy was pulling a prank, if that guy was mistaken, if that guy's just a bullshitter that exaggerates stories, then all of this falls apart. And so that's difficult to overcome. The way you would overcome it's to be like, but look, what he said ended up being the case and ended up being true. And Coleman's like, I mean, no, it didn't. Some of the things did, but many of the things didn't. And other things that were within the purview of that memo and what would have been happened that were never mentioned in the memo.
But I'm sure lots of people are exaggerating. The point is that the supreme leader of the NATO allies, okay, he's saying that his guy at the Defense Department said the decision's been made. My guess is that he's talking to people at the Defense Department who are in the know on this. And the point is, look, obviously, Coleman, the plan didn't go exactly according to plan. There's just no question about that. All of this is late 2001 here. This is still over a year, almost a year and a half until we invade Iraq. They all believed the hype. They all thought it was going to be a cakewalk. And in fact, that's another interesting thing that John Mearsheimer covers a bit there, right? Is that essentially this was Sharon's initial beef with invading Iraq. He was like, whoa. Like he's like, hey, I want Saddam Hussein overthrown, but we got to overthrow the mullahs in Iran first.
He did not say he wanted Saddam Hussein. What's your source on that? That Sharon said he wants...
It's the
In
envoy
fact,
of Sharon.
he warned Bush not to invade Iraq. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon warned Bush not to invade Iraq in February 2002, which is confirmed by the Israeli ambassador at the time, confirmed by Ehud Barak's former senior advisor,
again,
confirmed by Lawrence Wilkerson, the then chief.
Now, again, this is something, again, when you look at the framing of this, of Coleman that's being able to talk like he's constantly, and a big part of this, think where we're at right now. A big part of why we're here is because Dave didn't do a good job initially of outlining the framework for his argument. Because I sort of know, because I know just a little about this topic, but you have to remember, many of the people that are watching something like this are going to be far less informed than the two people debating. That's, in general, how things go. And so one question that I have that I don't believe I've received an answer to is, what does the Wesley Clark memo have to do with Israel? Now, I can intuit it was written by Donald Rumsfeld, and Rumsfeld deeply cares about Israel. Is, I guess, my intuition of why we're discussing this memo in the framework of Israel controlling or being a key part in forcing the United States to invade Iraq. But I'm doing that guesswork because Dave's never outlined it. The only thing Dave said really was, well, the clean break memo, I mean, come on, it must be true because of, like, Wesley Clark and what he heard. But that doesn't do that work for me. It's forcing me to, like, sort of make leaps of logic that are probably true and probably what Dave's saying, but I'm not 100% certain. And maybe other people wouldn't make the same conclusions that I am. So it would have behooved Dave to sort of outline this. If he would have gave an opening statement as opposed to sort of allowing Coleman to be like, let me tell you why I don't trust Mearsheimer and control the flow of this, now Dave's sort of on a back foot on this. So given that if that's the key, that it's like, remember, all of this, the Clean Break Memo, the Project for a New American Free Century writings, the amount of money Israel gave, and now the Wesley Clark thing, all of it hinges on the idea that Israel at the time of the Iraq War wanted the United States to go. Coleman says that's not true. Ariel Sharon and all of these key people around him were begging the United States at the time, don't go to war with Iraq. So even if everything you said over here, Dave, about those four things are true, the ultimate conclusion is Israel had influence, which forced the United States to do the decision that Israel wanted, which was attack Iraq. However, the leader of Israel at the time was saying, don't attack Iraq. So let's see what Dave says to that.
Chief of Staff to Colin Powell. The Prime Minister of Israel told Bush, do not invade Iraq. It's not going to work. And anyway, Iraq is weak. Iran is the real threat.
Yes, right.
This is a massive, glaring hole in your story.
No, it's not at all.
The idea that Israel pushed us into Iraq. Go ahead.
Okay, if you let me finish the sentence, then it's not a glaring hole in my story at all. What got them on board, ultimately, the Israelis, were that they were persuaded that Iran was going to be next. And they thought, all of them thought Iraq was going to be a cakewalk. Now, Iraq turned out to be a catastrophe. And so, of course, the plan didn't go exactly according to plan. But again, you don't find it interesting. Like, honestly, just on a human level, you got a 4-star general saying the decision's been made to overthrow the governments in Libya and Syria, and then we went and did it years later. You don't find that to be, that's kind of interesting to me. Yeah.
Now, Dave reframes, and that's fine. His reframe's fine there, but, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's almost a concession by Dave that he's wrong. And I'll explain why. Dave's initial point is that Coleman was like, let's talk about this. You said that basically the decision to invade Iraq was like largely because of Israel. That was the point that Dave's trying to defend, is the affirmative here. And what he just acknowledged there is actually Israel was against the invasion of Iraq, and they had to be talked into it by the United States because they thought more things would come from that. Now, there's a possible way that Dave could argue around this, but as it sits right now, I mean, that's almost a concession. It seems to me, based on me, the layman admitted, listening to this argument, what Dave just said was, actually, it was Israel that had to be drugged into wanting to invade Iraq. Of course, they did so because they thought they were going to get something more they wanted from the United States that ended up not happening. But it's just sort of like wag the dog position. Who is controlling whose foreign policy more? Is it that Israel is controlling the United States foreign policy in this issue on the invasion of Iraq? Or is it the United States is controlling Israel's? They're the ones sort of applying pressure and saying, no, you should go along with our decision. And it sounds to me like that's what Dave just admitted. I don't know. It's optically not good at this point for Dave.
No, because he never saw the guy who never saw the memo, heard about a memo, and no one else who's ever seen the memo has come out.
Forget the memo. He was told the decision's been made and we're doing this.
But how would he know? How would this guy know?
How would the guy at the Defense Department know? Because he's at the Defense Department.
But he's not the one making the decision.
Yes, but he didn't say he was the one making the decision. He said the decision's been made.
By who? By Bush?
Bush didn't imagine the top of the Defense Department. I don't know. Rumsfeld, Bush. I don't know.
Rumsfeld doesn't make the decision.
To get a lot more of this information, but we have what we have.
Okay, instead of trusting the 4-star general that didn't even read the memo because he wasn't allowed to, let's trust the people that were actually in the room. Condoleezza Rice, talking to Bush every single day of the entire administration, says that the decision was made to go into Iraq for sure on September 7th, 2002. If you have better information than that from other people that were in the room, I'd love to hear it. But in the absence of that, I'm not going to listen to a 4-star general that never read the memo that he's talking about.
Okay, again, it's not the memo.
And he says, I have a counter story that was on name. We have a person on name saying this is exactly when the decision was made, not before that. And it's not relying on some anonymous person. Again, persuasive. What I would have liked Coleman to do there is really capitalize on what I think is the most important of the debate thus far, which was what I just mentioned previously, that Dave seemed to concede. So a bit of a strategic blunder of Coleman not saying, whoa, before we move on back to that point, didn't you just say that it was actually the United States that convinced Israel of the importance of invading Iraq, that Israel was against it? Doesn't that completely dismantle your entire thesis here? So I think Coleman could have done a better job of really highlighting that, because Dave sort of implies a sleight of hand where he goes back to talking about Wesley Clark and the memo, etc. Whereas I think that Coleman really could have nailed home the point there. But still, he does a decent job of then going back to that point saying, but there were other people in the room.
I don't know how many times to say this. We're kind of going in circles here. Oh, okay, yeah. You got a 4-star general telling you the plan has been made that we're going to go fight all of these wars, and
we
then
didn't
we
even have a high enough
them.
Classification to read Pentagon memos. I'm supposed to listen to him over the National Security Advisor that was reading all of these memos and talking to Bush every day and talking to Rumsfeld and talking to Coleman.
Was also a member of the regime who was selling this war. So
Condoleezza Rice? No, she was not. She was not a neocon. She was not a Rump. She had a horrible relationship with Rump.
Now that's an argument that Dave needs to make. Well, of course, they're not going to come right out and admit this, right? You think the United States government's going to admit? By the way, we're just puppets of Israel. We do whatever they tell us. Of course they wouldn't, right? They're interested in selling what they're selling to the American people, so they're still selling it years later. Condoleezza Rice is still selling it. And Coleman pushes back. She's not really a neocon. Let's hear his explanation why.
With Rumsfeld.
No, I said she was a member of the regime who was selling the war, and that's exactly what she was.
But why would that make her less of an authority on what the plans were?
It's not a matter of making her less of an authority. It makes her less trustworthy, and he's not more of an authority or more trustworthy. The fact is that much of what he said came true, and that's what makes it interesting. Okay,
so then we're back to, like, as I said earlier, did it happen or not? And it's like 60% of what they suggested happened, but 40% didn't, and a bunch of stuff outside that you would assume, like regime change in Liberia, would have also been included wasn't. So maybe 50% of the memo happened? Not in the time frame, not in the suggested order. I don't know. Make of that what you will. It's sort of like when you hear these predictions from, like, Nostradamus and stuff. And it'll be like, oh, wow, if I read into it, this prediction looks like it came accurate. And then you find out, like, yeah, but the dude wrote thousands upon thousands of things, and it's all, like, none of it literally happened, but there are interpretations that you could stretch and be like, ah, yes. Does that mean he was really clairvoyant, could see into the future? Probably not.
If we had never invaded Libya, never invaded Syria, never taken any of the actions that we took in the war on terrorism, then yeah, it would be much less relevant that a general said he saw that the decision had been made in 2001.
Okay. Well, everyone else in the room does not say the decision had been made. And he was not in these rooms making these decisions with the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor and George Bush.
So it's just a complete coincidence that we went and overthrew those regimes that he heard that we were going to.
We have contingency plans for all kinds of things.
Again, that's not what this is what Douglas Murray tried to do too. It's not a contingency plan.
When you're the Pentagon writing 60 memos a day, I guarantee you will troll those memos and find information and plans for every possible contingency in the world. The burden is still on you.
This is not what we're talking about.
Out one at.
Again, another good framing by Coleman there. The burden is on Dave, and he makes the point. There are 20,000 memos. You could have found positions for anything. For example, let's say things went the exact opposite. That we invaded Somalia and we invaded, Chad or something. There was probably a memo that said that. That doesn't mean that memo was the reason.
Out of the 60,000 and say that this was important. But can we get to Sharon?
But that's just not what you're doing. It's just not what I'm doing. I'm not saying there was a memo once that said something. I'm saying that a 4-star general said the decision had been made, that he had sources in the Defense Department. His sources in the Defense Department.
Who was basing it on what? The memo.
Okay, fine, but even if it's not, but the issue isn't that there's a memo. The issue is whether a decision has been made here. There might be lots of memos that go out every day, but a memo that says we're going to topple 7 countries in the next 5 years, a pretty big memo. That's not just one of the regular memos. That's the point.
Evidence it was a big memo? Your only evidence is the guy who never read it. You realize how ridiculous this is. You couldn't, if you were a historian writing a book, you'd have to cut this out of the book because you're relying on the hearsay of someone that never even read the document, much less you or I have never read the document. And we know that they were writing 60 documents a day that Condoleezza Rice was putting in the trash. It's a ridiculously low bar of evidence you'd have to consider this memo and everything implied by it important.
I mean, I don't know how else to say this, dude. This just feels so nutty to me. I guess we'll just leave this up to people.
Okay. Can we talk about Sharon, though?
1 second. I'm just saying, I guess we'll leave it up to the audience to decide. I think having the head of the NATO allied forces and a 4-star general saying he was informed that the decision has been made to fight all of these wars, and then we went on and fought a whole bunch of them, I think that's a pretty relevant detail. And I'm not a historian writing a book. I'm a guy talking about these issues to the American people.
So again, fair enough. They're leaving it up to the audience. For me, I have my biases. Don't get me wrong, but I'm far more persuaded by Coleman's argument. And remember, the burden of proof is on Dave. So for me, it doesn't sound that great for Dave. He's just like, well, but Wesley Clark was an important general in NATO, and he must have trusted this guy at the DOD. So, but Coleman's making the more specific argument. But wait a minute, there's all these other memos, and who was this guy at the DOD, and could he have been exaggerating? And we haven't even seen the memo. Wesley Clark makes his claims ultimately because of the existence of this memo. So what was the memo? Who is the person talking about the memo? We don't know. So anyways, now the Ariel Sharon thing, I think ultimately is where Dave was the weakest. So smart of Coleman to want to bring it back there. Let's see how that ends.
Also, I don't know. You can decide whether you find that to be a pretty interesting story or not.
Okay, let's go on to Sharon, because this is the core of the issue. You said earlier, I mentioned, and you agree that Sharon warned Bush in February 22 not to go into Iraq, and that Iran was the big threat. But then you said the Israelis got on board when they were guaranteed that Iran would be after Iraq.
Yes,
is that right? So then, how does that?
Mearsheimer really is my source on this.
Okay, how does but I'm not following your logic, because how does that all add up to the Israelis pushed us into Iraq? Because there's still that he warned us. That sounds more.
Yeah, and Coleman picks up exactly. That sounds like evidence to the opposite of your conclusion. That sounds like the United States pushing Israel into the war, not Israel pushing the United States. Absolutely. And this is the best argument in the debate thus far. And a big blunder by Dave. And it's going to be tough to work yourself out of this and hear your explanation. Because to me, it really seems like that's really a pretty big defeater to the entire thesis.
Like
Well-
that sounds more like we pulled them into Iraq. That's your argument.
Well, no, I mean, look, it's not, again, my argument isn't either of those things
Because
exactly.
you're saying we had to persuade them by putting out Iran as a chip, and we had to loop them into it. That's exactly what you just said.
Listen, yeah, but they're not monoliths here, right? So essentially you have different factions within all of these groups, right? So you have the neoconservatives who were always more closely aligned with the Likud guys and Benjamin Netanyahu. As Sharon, I think, was a Likud at one point and then split with the party and formed his own thing. Like he had his own weird falling outs with Benjamin Netanyahu over the years.
He was Likud at the time of the Iraq War decision. He was the leader of the Likud party.
He was
and
still
the country.
Likud at that point, sure.
Yes.
But there's still different factions. It's not Benjamin Netanyahu. It was Sharon, and who Benjamin Netanyahu a few years later quit the government over some of Sharon's policies, I believe. I think it was sorry, I'm just getting confused in my own head here. I think it was the withdrawal in 2005 is when Netanyahu quit the government. But so you had the neoconservatives and Benjamin Netanyahu, who that wing, they were pushing for Iraq first. The Sharon's envoy, at least according to at least the first envoy that he sent over, right? He goes, whoa, no, we should go after Iran first. And that was like their issue. And they were essentially that group won, and they persuaded the other group that they would do Iran next, which also lines up with, General Wesley Clark's statement about how Iran would be the final regime that was overthrown.
Okay, so your argument
also didn't come true, by the way.
So let me just nail down what you're arguing. You're arguing that there's a split in the Likud party between the pro-Iraq and the anti-Iraq invasion. And within the Likud party, the pro-Iraq invasion element persuaded the anti-Iraq invasion Sharon element. That's your argument?
No, I mean, the argument is really that the neoconservatives drove the war and that they agreed with Benjamin Netanyahu, who also, as you know, came over that year and testified that we should go overthrow
That was
Saddam
after the
Hussein.
decision had already been made. That was on September 12th. According to Condoleezza Rice, they had a big meeting on September 7th, and they agreed on the war in Iraq. The fact that Netanyahu testified to Congress 5 days later, after the decision has been made. I mean, if you're saying Joe is the reason I moved to New York, but I didn't talk to Joe until after I made the decision,
No.
then this is totally irrelevant. What matters is what was happening during the time that the U.S. security establishment was debating Iraq, which was winter of 22 to summer of 22. And during this time, we have multiple sources, including Lawrence Wilkerson, who is no fan of the neocons. He's acerbic about the neocons and acerbic about the Israel lobby, which he says is too powerful. This is Colin Powell's chief of staff. He hates the Israel lobby. Nevertheless, he said let me quote you from him, actually.
So this is great. Two things. First off, right, like I think Coleman's pointing out in a polite way, like a bit of a mush-mouthed response that doesn't really make sense. Your initial argument is Israel basically forced the United States' hand into getting involved in the invasion of Iraq. And now it's, Israel was divided. Israel's leadership was saying not to go, but there was a faction within inside Israel that wanted to go. Then the United States decides to go, and they help convince the pro-invasion portion of the Likud to convince Ariel Sharon of the Likud to go along with it. That's a far cry from Israel made this decision. It's a far cry. And now Coleman's going to further say, here's a person that's not a neocon, that despises the neocons and despises Israel's influence, and here's what he's going to say. So let's hear what he says.
He said in the New Republic, he goes, hold on, let me find it. He confirms the basic picture. Hold on, let me find it really fast. Okay, so he says, Lawrence Wilkerson, who hates the Israel lobby, says, the Israelis were telling us Iraq is not the enemy. Iran is the enemy. The Israelis tried their best to persuade us that we were focused on the wrong enemy. But once they understood that we were going to war, come hell or high water, they weren't going to get on the wrong side of the President of the United States. That's Lauren Wilkerson, who hates the Israel lobby, chief of staff to the Secretary of State during these years in the New Republic. So everyone that is in the room says that basically what the Israelis did, and Sharon is the leader of the party and leader of the country, tells Bush, this Iraq idea is stupid. It's not going to work. Democracy doesn't work in the Middle East anyway. Iran is the threat. You should be focused on them. Bush tells them to F off. We're going into Iraq. And then Sharon says, okay, well, we didn't convince them. We might as well support our biggest allies because we never want to be on the wrong side of America. That's actually what happened. And then once a decision is made, after that point, Netanyahu testifies to Congress saying, oh, we love the war in Iraq, testifies as a citizen, not as a leader of the party. And everyone in the room corroborates this story.
Okay. I would just say I highly recommend people read Mearsheimer's book, The Israel Lobby. The guy, this world-renowned scholar, wrote a book about the most controversial topic in the world. And so he just went out of his way to back up everything he says in the book. But the whole point is that, yes, initially there were people in Sharon's camp who didn't want to they all wanted to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Let's get real. They were worried about doing it first before
Congress
you
did.
go.
We signed the Iraq Liberation Act in 98. Right. So it was bipartisan policy to push for regime change.
So that kind of helps my point. So let me just finish the point I'm making. Right, exactly. So that totally backs up what I was just saying.
Not that Israel was behind it.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, continue your point. I'm sorry.
All right, man. Go ahead. Okay. Yeah, you're right. Israel was totally against the war in Iraq. The whole year, AIPAC and the neocons and the Israel government were not pushing for the war in Iraq. Anyway, I'd highly recommend people go read the book. It's all backed up in there. There's tons of evidence on it. AIPAC was bragging, by the way, about how their influence over the thing.
They bought the Iraq war for dentist money?
Yeah. No, I didn't say that, actually. It's just a lot of straw manning, man. How about just if I don't say it, don't just make that my argument for me. Anyway.
But that's exactly what Dave just did. We'll end it there. Dave ultimately just sort of straw man was like, oh, well, as if they didn't eventually support it. But Dave's initial argument was they were instrumental in forcing the United States into the Iraq war. Now at the end, he's like, oh, as if they weren't on board. You're right. Everyone, yeah, Dave, that's what's been argued, at least in this debate. And, I think optically another loss there at the end by Dave, just an appeal to you. I don't know what to say. Just go read the book. And that's not effective debate strategy. Ultimately, at the end of the day, on this meta topic, which would, again, this conversation is from about 8 months ago. So we're filming this on June 8th, 2026. And this occurred about 8 months previous. So towards the end of 2025, I believe in October 2025, this was pre-United States attack on Iran here under the second Trump administration. It's very interesting to see how this conversation fit in that time and place. And for me, I think it is a good effort by both participants. I do. It's refreshing to see a debate where there's not a bunch of screaming back and forth. But to me, Coleman easily wins this debate. I think that the lessons to take from this is the importance of having pre-planned a strategy and knowing the specific claims that your opponent's going to make, and then researching those claims to see if that's true or not. And I think Coleman did a tremendous job of that, and also did a tremendous job of framing and not losing sight of the initial thesis that it was Israel that forced the United States into Iraq and not the other way. Because of that, he was able to continually frame throughout all of the meta parts of this conversation back to that topic. Dave, it seems at points, loses track of the topic, and I think it's indicative right out of the bat that he doesn't take his opportunity to outline his framework. As such, it's easier for him to sort of get more lost in what was going on. So ultimately, I think in this meta conversation, Coleman did a tremendous job and comes away the victor on this particular topic. So, all right, that'll be it for this debate. Again, remember, like and subscribe. We'll be doing more debates that are important in today's society. We're going to try to put those up almost weekly. So thanks so much, everyone, and have a good one. All right. Well, that thing's not working. First off, let's read Super Chats. Sip Cuppy, or sick, I said Sip Cuppy. Yeah, I am dyslexic. Sick Puppy, thank you for being a member. Really appreciate it. Alan's Alps, $20 says, You don't even need the clean break memo. It's completely incoherent to be concerned about Israel's hegemony and borders of Israel, supposedly for our benefit, but do the complete opposite demographically, replacing only Western countries. Prove that proves that Israel's controlling it. We're also concerned about all sorts of issues in NATO and the European Union, etc. Does that mean that they're controlling? I agree. The people that control our country are dog shit most of the time. Okay? Does that prove it's because of Israel? Alan's Alps, $20 says the evidence the memo has significance literally all happened. Quite the opposite is true. Unless you're arguing Dave was incorrect. I forget the 7 countries that were suggested within 5 years. Didn't occur within 5 years. Didn't occur in the order that they suggested. Wasn't 7 that ended up having regime change. It was 4, right? There were other countries outside the scope of the memo that had regime change. Continues, even though none of those countries had anything to do with 9/11, and the countries were listed were in the memo, obviously, before 9/11. I don't think the things you're talking about occurred, though. And then Alan's Alps, thanks again for $10, says, creating a duality with did Israel push U.S. versus U.S. pushing Israel is a distinction without difference. Why? Because there was never a post-World War II political posture not in Israeli favor. Absurd. That's an absurd statement. Saying that a country forced us to do something other than we took actions that were beneficial to a country are immensely important. Because it could mean that the United States is taking actions that they find important for their own reasons that also have to be mutually beneficial to a country like Israel. Of course, there were actions that were taken by U.S. foreign policy that weren't beneficial to Israel. The Iran deal. There's one that right off the top of my head. Was that beneficial to Israeli foreign policy? Giving billions of dollars to Iran? Was it? Now, every time I bring this up to people, what they say is, yeah, but actually that was also beneficial because things that are on its face beneficial to Israel are obviously beneficial to Israel. But things that seem to be the opposite of what Israel wants are also beneficial to Israel because it makes the case for Israel even stronger in the future. For example, if the United States funds Hamas to bomb Israel, that helps Israel because it allows them to say we're the victim, which justifies them attacking Hamas. If the United States destroys the Hamas, that's obviously because of Israel, because Hamas doesn't like Israel. So whether the United States funds Hamas or destroys Hamas, both are at the behest of Israel. Okay, what are the reasons that it was beneficial to the United States? If the United States feels that Iran was trying to assassinate the president, if the United States feels that Iran is trying to get a weapon of mass destruction, those would all be beneficial. Can you tell me how it wouldn't be harmful if Iran had a nuclear bomb to the United States in its interest? That's your claim. It's absurd to think for any reason it would be beneficial to keep Iran from getting a weapon. Now you'll change the fact to it, but Iran wasn't trying to get the weapon. What I'm trying to make is that there is obviously things that the United States would have interest. Maybe the United States wanted to have a friendly regime in Iran in order to help squeeze pressure on China because China had a cozy energy relationship with Iran. So it would be beneficial to the United States vis-a-vis their relationship with China. I don't like the attack on Iran. My claim is to say all of it, like every form, what was your claim? At the Iran situation and every post-World War II political posture was all controlled by Israel. All of it. Since World War II. I don't believe that. I don't believe the evidence has been presented. In this particular debate, we took one situation, Iraq, and it turned out, based on what was argued, that the exact opposite was true. That actually it was the United States dragging Israel along and not the other way. But all of it's hand waved away by, no, trust me, bro. Even when it looks like it's not for Israel, it is for Israel. Let's see some other amazing points. I saw some there towards the end. Of course, Rob sides with his fellow paid show. Coleman Hughes, I'm a goy slave. Dancing Israelis. Coleman, God of the Gaps. That's exactly what Dave is. Rubio did not say we did the war for Israel. That's a lie. I sold my soul to the Antichrist just like Andrew Wilson. This is why no one takes you people seriously, and nor should they. If anyone's on the payroll of Israel, it's people like that. This guy is on the payroll of Israel. Let me explain why. Because he is such a low IQ piece of shit that comes in hurling insults like you're on the side of the Antichrist, that your initial reaction is to actually be more sympathetic to Israel. So I am totally convinced that pieces of shit like this are paid by the Israeli government in order to make people more sympathetic. That's the best possible explanation, because they're so fucking stupid and odious in their behavior that there's no way, if they were trying to actually convince people that we need to break more away from Israel, that they would behave like this. None. There's no chance. So the best possible explanation is that it's the exact opposite. By the way, hilariously, the last time I tried to review this debate and was explaining it and I had tech problems, I had a Zionist telling me I was a piece of shit and sold out to anti-Zionism. My arguments are dog shit because you're shilling. Where was I wrong about my review of that debate? This is the other thing. So many people are incapable of actually trying to set their biases aside, which I'll admit's impossible. But you tried your best to limit those biases as much as possible to look at a debate. I know Israel's the Antichrist, and I know they control all of our foreign policy since World War II. So clearly Dave Smith dominated the debate, and Coleman Hughes is paid for by Israel. Excellent analysis. Good shit. Man, I'm assuming your channel is crushing it with analysis like that. Alan's Alps, $5 says, if it was really about China, then the U.S. would want just dump Israel and have an economic partnership with Iran. There's only one reason that's not true. Yep, that could be the only reason. We would completely say, fuck you, Israel. We're just going to have a relationship with Iran, and then that'll hurt China. There wouldn't be any potential negative consequences to that. That's the only possible reason. That's it. It's just so tiresome. I'm sorry. I've been convinced. Never mind. I've been convinced. Yeah, obviously Dave Smith won the debate. Coleman Hughes is paid by Israel, which are the Antichrist. Go for it. Jews. Now I'm good. Now I'm speaking the truth. Yeah, I guess if we just went to Iran and said, hey man, we know how you guys like hate America. That's the other thing. I love the whitewashing of like extreme Islam, right? They're great people. They're just amazing. Like the Iranian leadership would be absolutely, let's be allies, United States. Of course. Of course. Yes, of course. That's all it would have taken. Hey, we'd like to throw Israel under the bus and let you take them out. That way we could have a stronger posture against China. Will you join us? Absolutely, United States. We've always been your biggest fan. We're huge fans of you. We've just always hated Israel. It's not that Muslims dislike Christians. It's always been about the Jews. Muslims actually love Christians, and they wouldn't do anything negative to Christians whatsoever. Mm. Yep, that's true. We are allies with Saudi Arabia. There was evidence that there was potential funding of Saudi Arabia in 9/11. Where does that get to the Jews controlled everything? I'm sorry. I missed it. I missed that portion. Anyways, we'll be wrapping up here. Now, if anyone else wanted to put super chats in, it'd be much appreciated. But it was fun to do this review. I fully expect anytime the issue of Israel comes up, of course, you can expect the people like, you sold out. You're the Antichrist. Israel controls everything. By the way, Allens, if Israel's controlled literally every foreign policy posture since World War II, can you explain the Iran deal? Were they in favor of it? When Obama and Biden put in the Iran deal? After all, they control our foreign policy. So they had to be in favor of it, correct? Nobody said the Jews are controlling everything. That is like saying Italians control everything because the mobs exist. Thank you for the $5. I want you to meet my friend, also named Alan Zalps, who said, there was never a post-World War II political posture not in Israel's favor. You said it doesn't matter. This is what this post was saying. Sure, it looks like Dave lost the debate. That actually it was the United States that drug Israel into supporting the Iraq War and not the opposite. But that doesn't matter. Why? Because every political posture that we've had since World War II benefited Israel. So it's still all because of Israel. Okay, if that's the case, Alan Zalps, why did they do the Iran deal? Why did the Obama administration do it? Why did the Biden administration? There hasn't been one posture that wasn't for Israel's benefit. Okay, what was the Israeli benefit to the Iran deal? Go ahead. Should I listen to the Alan Zalps that at 1:38 p.m. said nobody's saying Jews control everything? Or should I listen to the Alan Zalps 17 minutes prior that said every decision has been for Israelis' favor? Which Alan Zalps should I listen to here? I know a lot has changed in your life in that 17 minutes to seemingly get the exact opposite position. So I'm just wondering which one I should adapt here. No, I'm not dropping the link. I'm not calling in. No, I have to go. Explain the point. You just said seemingly two contradictory things. You can say in a sentence or two. Go ahead, explain. Was the Iran deal posturing that was pro-Israel? I already know the answer. Actually, yes. What was the key was to send this money to Iran that we knew they would use to fund Hezbollah, which would then give Israel the excuse after like the October 7th type thing to actually start a genocide in Palestine. That's the argument. As I said, so the argument is funding Iran, that's pro-Israeli. Attacking Iran, that's pro-Israeli. It doesn't matter. Ignoring Iran, that would somehow be deemed pro-Israeli. All the evidence will be deemed to match the pre-confirmed conclusion. See? That's literally their argument. It doesn't matter. If the United States says, let's have a deal and send you billions of dollars and be your ally, Iran, that's pro-Israeli. If the United States says, fuck you, we're bombing you, Iran, that's pro-Israeli. Doesn't matter. The details are irrelevant. All you have to do is everything the United States does is pro-Israel. Okay, but the United States did that. Okay, that's pro-Israel. Now the United States has factionalism. But your claim was not that there are factionalism, that sometimes decisions are made that are pro-Israel and sometimes they're not. Your argument was, quote, because there was never a post-World War II political posture not in Israel's favor. But if there's U.S. factionalism, that seems to be an absurd statement. How could that be? You were very definitive. Quote, there was never a post-World War II political posture not in Israel's favor. I'm like, what about the Iran deal? You're like, well, there's factions within the United States. So some will be pro-Israel and some will be anti. Well, that sounds to me like then there would have been post-World War II political posturing that was not pro-Israel. Sounds like you're full of shit. Sounds like you're trying to do a nice sleight of hand. Well, it turns out that it was Israel drug into the Iraq war, not the other way around. Yeah, but that doesn't matter because that was just the U.S. politicians dragging Israel for Israel. It was still all about Israel because every position, political posturing's always been about favoring Israel. So that's what that was about. Really? Well, here's another decision. Well, there's different factions in the United States. Anyways, I'm sure the rest of you can see what's going on. But it was a fun review, so we'll get that up eventually. I should be back around 10 p.m. tonight. I have yard work to go to. So I told myself I had about 2 hours. I guess I have 8 more minutes. But then I got to go. Well, no, that's. I disagree fundamentally. I mean, yes, I guess, but no. Like, if you make a. I mean, what a way to get out of ever losing any debate. Here's the debate prompt. Well, I've lost the prompt, but cumulatively, if you know everything else that's ever happened in the world, then technically you would see that I was correct about the prompt. I disagree. If the cumulative makeup, if he's wrong about this key port in the cumulative makeup, if we go to the next one, what if Coleman wins that debate as well? And then the next one, Coleman wins that debate. How many cumulative losses need to add up before we say, well, maybe this cumulative worldview is incorrect? Here's 10 things that prove my point that Israel controls our foreign policy. All right, let's go to number 1. Okay, I've lost that. Let's go to number 2. Okay, I've lost that. Let's go to number 3. Okay, I've lost that. But hey, cumulatively, 1, 2, and 3 are true because the ones we haven't talked about yet. There's some mushmouth bullshit. Factionalism's not mutually exclusive with our posture, never changing, especially considering Iran agreed to the deal we broke. Okay, so then your argument is the posture of the Iran deal was pro-Israel. That's your argument. It never changed. The posture was always pro-Israel. Even though it was anti-Israel. Even though it was exactly what Israel didn't want. That was Obama and Biden's motivation. We're doing the Iran deal because it's all about Israel. That's why we're doing the Iran deal. Iran not having nuclear weapons is still in favor of Israel, Rob. Well then, we could say every single policy that was to prevent any war ever would be in Israel's favor. Amazing. Truly amazing. So Israel could even say, don't do this. Don't send money to Iran. Fucking stop it. And yet it was still because of Israel that we sent the money to Iran. There's a litany of, over the years, there's a litany of U.S. decisions that you could say Israel was like, we're against this, we're against this, we're against this. Now, the general thesis is everything in the United States, or the vast majority of it's controlled by Israel. So even when Israel's specifically telling us, don't do this, and we do it, that too is because of Israel. All of it. It can't be that the United States has interest for Iran to not have nuclear weapons. Nope, that can't factor in. It's just Israel. Even when Israel is telling us, don't do this, that's still because of Israel controlling our foreign policy. Unbelievable. outsized influence and coercion. I don't disagree that that Israel and Qatar and the European Union and China and many countries have far too much outside control and coercion over the United States. That's true. That does not mean that all of the decisions that are being made are controlled by Israel. It's not what it means. It doesn't mean that Israel controlled us going into war with Iran. Israel wanted us. Israel gave advice. But the idea that there were not reasons outside the scope of just to benefit Israel that Trump couldn't have made. And I say this as someone who's against the attack in Iran. Iran's pursuing nuclear weapons because of the existential threat of Israel. Disagree. That could be a prime motivator, but that would also be true if Israel no longer existed. Iran would still have motivation to have nuclear weapons. Same reason that North Korea had motivations. If that didn't exist, Iran would have no reason to be hostile to the United States. That's not true. Iran would have reason to be hostile to the United States even outside the scope of Israel. Just like Islam in general, in a political motivation, has reason to be hostile to Christian nations outside the scope of Israel existing. It's nonsensical. Why do Muslims commit terror attacks? Only because of Israel? Or do they have their own motivations? All right, anyways, it's been 2 hours. I do appreciate everyone's commentary. Anyways, I should be back around 10 p.m. this evening. I may be doing the extravaganza. I don't know. I don't know what the deal is with that. We'll have to see. Yeah. But this is my point. Take the Iraq War. The neocons had a relationship with the defense industry. They pushed the war because it was in their interest, not for the American people at large. I largely agree. Okay, what's that have to do with Israel? It's like, well, I'll say something like open borders, and people are like, Israel? And it's like, really? You think the same from the river to the sea people that are advocating open borders, that fucking hate Israel and see it wiped off the face of the earth, that also want open borders, wouldn't be cheering for open borders if it wasn't for Israel? That's the argument? Yep. Really? Uh-huh. And then when those people come in, like these Somalians that fucking hate us and commit all this fraud and all this bullshit against Americans, that too is because they're being influenced by Israel? Yep. Really? Yeah. Can I see proof of that? Oh, you goy shill! You're being paid by Israel? What? I think Israel has too much influence. If it was me, they'd never get to spend another dime in our politics system again. Difficult to do, but that would be ultimately what I would want. Oh, you fucking goy slave! How dare you not think that everything ever isn't because of Israel? Then you get into the specifics. Well, we're not saying everything's because of Israel. Yes, you are. Or a good many of you are. The neocons were a faction of people pushing for Israel's interests. So you have the interest of Israel and the defense industry. They weren't pushing for Israel's interest. Israel was specifically saying, don't go to war in Iraq, as we just said. Similarly, I'll make the same leap of faith. Open borders are pushed by people that are anti-Israel. And so therefore it is the anti-Israel people that are pushing for open borders. It's anti-Israel interests that are pushing for open borders. The vast majority of the politicians in the United States that are pushing for open borders, anti-Israel. The vast majority of the people that are protesting for open borders and stopping deportations, anti-Israel. Therefore, it is an anti-Israel motivation to have open borders. Right? Same difference. All righty, I gotta go. Thank you so much. Even the people I'm disagreeing with, no one's been out of line. I thought it's been the one guy's a fucking sack of shit that said I sold out to the Antichrist. But notice he hasn't made a fucking solid argument. At least Xphobic and Allens are actually making points. Like that stupid fuck. What's he doing? Nothing. because he's paid for by Israel, that guy. So Exphobic and Allens, I would really go to this guy, and he seems to be a pro-Israel shill that's pretending to be the opposite. So I'd really rein that guy in. You might want to tell that guy, would you shut the fuck up? We're at least trying to make arguments, unlike you stupid sack of shit. So anyways, it's been a lot of fun. I do appreciate y'all, and it makes the show better when we have people that are disagreeing. So I should be back around 10 p.m. this evening. I'm not quite sure what we're going to talk about yet. I think I want to talk about what's going on in California. I think that'll be a big focus that we're being gaslit into believing. Trust us, it's all above board. So could be interesting. Anyways, thank you so much to my mods. Thank you so much to my editor, Black Elk. Special thanks to Coleman, Hughes, and Dave Smith, who I assume have no problem with me reviewing their debate. But I thank both of them. I thought it was a good performance by both to analyze. So, all right, I should be back around 10 p.m. Eastern tonight. We'll see you guys later. As always, have a good one.